19th century Britain had rewritten the rules and pushed the boundaries of modern-day engineering. In a bold quest to continue this progress, engineers in Sheffield embarked on building a colossal new dam. But in the face of progress, the forces of nature were to strike at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. During a night that shook the country, the Dale Dyke Dam at Sheffield burst its mighty banks. Within 20 minutes the city was underwater. Waves of over 50 feet consumed everything in its path. Houses were demolished, torn up from their foundations and carried away. Generations of families lost forever. Nearly 250 innocent people died that fateful night, swept to their death in the Forgotten Flood.
Because of Jesus, I've got a door into God. And that's why I can look this tragedy in the face and still believe. Amen.
The Great Sheffield Flood is a fading memory, the tragedy almost airbrushed from history. Few still gather to commemorate the events and remember the dead. On the 140th anniversary, families and people of the affected communities came together to remember those that perished on that cold winter's night so many years ago.
140 years ago, this very morning, there were huge numbers of sightseers came out to see the devastation. And what we're really doing is saying, to this very morning, that's what people were doing.
Descendants of the dead and relatives of those that miraculously survived gathered to take part in a remembrance service, slideshow presentation and a walk retracing the flood's path.
The flood is a very important part of the history of Sheffield. As we saw today, there are many families here who can trace back to people who actually died on that tragic night.
I have an elder cousin, and one day she said to me, why don't you go and find out something about great-grandfather Thomas, who nearly drowned in the Sheffield Flood? And I said, well, what sort? I'd never heard of this. I'd never even heard of the Sheffield Flood. And the story she told me very briefly, as related to her by our grandmother, was that Thomas Brown, who was my great-grandfather, was living and working in Sheffield in 1864 on the night of the flood, and water had rushed through the house. He'd managed to keep his head above water by climbing on top of a cabinet in the kitchen, and managed to save his life. But in the same room were his younger sister and her husband, who both drowned.
I am all the way from South Africa and have had this fantastic experience coming here now to the Sheffield Flood and finding out about my family, the Buckleys, who not long ago I didn't even really realise were relatives of mine. Where this is being held obviously means that I'm now in touch with the area where they were walking, where they lived, where they experienced their whole existence. You feel as if you now identified your family, you're living their lives, or certainly understanding a little bit more about your roots.
Right, what we're going to look at now.
Malcolm Nunn leads the events and along the way recounts the history of his own ancestors.
The first crack were discovered by a man called William Horsfield, who happened to be brother to my great-great-grandfather. And late afternoon on 11th of March that he was coming across me, he saw what appeared to be water like running down outer side of embankment. And he investigated, and he found this crack which water was seeping out of, just big enough to get a knife blade or his finger ends in it. So he reported it to a man called Hamerton. And stories, they tried various ways to relieve water pressure on the dam, but it eventually failed, and about half an hour before midnight the dam actually burst.
When you go around the valleys of Sheffield and you see the big dams, you can begin to imagine what the devastation must have been when one of them burst and so many people were killed in such a tragic night.
1864, Queen Victoria reigned, Britain was leading the Industrial Revolution, its people at the forefront of world production. In Middle England, the city of Sheffield was bustling with a population of more than 500,000. Industry was driving the city, mills and factories were the lifeblood of the communities. But it was the need to feed this industry that led the Victorians to embark on building a huge dam that could provide the city with a constant supply of water it was thirsting for. Built on 7 hills, Sheffield was abundant in the peaks and troughs of valleys. Its geography and landscape made it the prime environment to harness water power and make use of the river system. In order to capitalise on this, the Waterworks Company began constructing the Dale Dyke Dam. In March 1864, the dam held a massive 700 million gallons of water. 5 years in the making, it stood proud just weeks from completion. Its scale and design was an engineering feat, but its durability was untested. Charged with the task of overseeing the dam build was John Gunson. He lived in the city centre, was a resident engineer at the site of the build. Gunson was assigned to the task of coordinating the workers, known as navvies, to build the massive Dale Dyke reservoir. With years of experience and a list of successful dam builds to his credit, the Dale Dyke Dam was to be his and the company's greatest achievement. Situated just 8 miles north of Sheffield, the new dam, the largest of its time, was almost ready. The wall tapered towards the top where the apex was 12 feet thick, its base spanning 1,200 feet. It stood at around 100 feet high, about the height of 4 double-decker buses. The sheer magnitude of the dam was truly groundbreaking. In March 1864, both the industries and the people of Sheffield were excited at the prospect of a new reservoir. Fresh water was crucial in guarding against killer diseases such as cholera, which were rife in early Victorian times. For it was the Dale Dyke Reservoir that would ultimately secure a healthy and a prosperous future. Lining the valley bottom were small hamlets and villages, many of which fell victim to the forces of the flood. Just 5 miles downstream from Dale Dyke lay Malin Bridge, a close-knit community centred around the 3 pubs located on the banks of the River Loxley. 2 of the original 3 pubs still stand, and in the Malin Bridge Inn, previously known as the Cleacombe Public House, people are gathering. Interspersed between the slides and stories, hosted by Malcolm Nunn, are acting sketches by a local drama group, recounting the events that unfolded 140 years earlier.
The crack in the dam was found about 5:30 on the afternoon of March 11th by a man called William Horsfield.
There's young Stevenson Fountain to see you. He says his arm Mr. Fountain sent him.
I'm sorry to bother you on such a terrible night, sir, but my father sent me to tell you there's a crack in down wall.
A crack? Where? How big is it, lad?
It's about 50 foot long and about 12 foot from the top of the wall.
The countdown began on a chain of events that were to leave a scar on generations and landscapes alike.
Come on, quick, get your things together. It's ready for breaking this any time. Come on now.
There's no pulse enough to break through that wall, so you take it easy, lass.
It was around 8 p.m. when John Gunson received word of the crack from messenger boy Stevenson Fountain. Immediately he set out on the 8-mile trek through the city and hamlets to Dale Dyke. His horse and cart clattered through the streets of Sheffield. The wind was whistling and the rain lashing into his face. As he travelled, he attempted to observe the rivers and streams coming down the valley. He noticed little difference. The water was dashing rapidly and the white foam glimmered through the darkness as it bobbled over the rocks. Gunson eventually arrived at the dam site some 2 hours later. It was now around 10 p.m. and the weather was worsening. Reports suggest by this time the crack was wide enough to fit a man's fist. Gunson and George Swindon, the company overseer, quickly went about their inspection. One of the first actions taken that night was to open the outlet pipe's valve. 5 men struggled for over an hour, the pressure of the water making it an almost impossible task, but with the 2 pipes fully open and the water gushing out, the dam was only emptying about 30,000 gallons a minute, not even a dent to its massive 700 million gallon capacity. The embankment was now struggling to take the strain. Gunson realised further action must be taken to avoid any breach in the dam wall. He quickly set the navvies to the task of setting an explosive to blast a gap in the wall of the bywash. With the rain now whipping horizontally, the gunpowder was damp and wouldn't light. Gunson continued his investigation and began to check for any leaks. Unable to find any, he felt it unnecessary to send a general warning down the valley. A decision that was to have fatal consequences. Swelled by the bad weather, the dam's waves were now close to breaking over the wall. Gunson and Swindon walked further along the dam wall, carefully checking the water level. At this point, Gunson looked up through the moonlit rain to see a thin sheet of white water slide over the top of the dam wall and down under his feet and into the crack. In an act that now seems totally senseless, Gunson moved briskly down the embankment and made his way to the valve house to calculate the amount of water running there. As he did so, George Swindon felt something was radically wrong and shouted for him to
keep clear!
Gunson heeded the warning, but as he emerged, he saw the initial breach in the crest of the dam about 30 metres wide. In a cruel, ironic twist, the dynamite that wouldn't previously light suddenly exploded. Gunson exclaimed to his companions,
"It's all up! The embankment is going!"
At the time of the flood, the dam was thought to hold over 700 million gallons of water. Imagine Niagara Falls flowing freely over Sheffield for about 9 seconds. That was the amount of water that tumbled down the valley. As the waves crashed down over the broken wall, the embankment sank and the full force of the water started to roll down the valley like an avalanche. A thunderous roar preceded the 50-foot wave as it picked up trees by the roots and rocks and boulders from the side of the valley. The strange sound of dogs barking wildly was the only warning some villagers received. After the initial torrent, there was a second terrific burst that barreled its way down the valley, causing further destruction. It has since been calculated that the speed of the flood was 18 miles an hour. The force of the water was tremendous. A government inspector was quoted as saying,
"Not even a Derby horse could have carried the warning in time to have saved the people down the valley."
The flood took just 20 minutes to reach the city centre, leaving devastation in its wake. On the 12th of March 1864, an eerie morning calm descended upon Sheffield, and so began a day unlike any that had gone before. At Low Bradfield, the first death was thought to be a one-day-old child swept from its mother's arms. Some suggest it was in a cottage that still stands today.
When the flood came, my husband heard the noise of it and got out of bed to look. He cried out with horror what he saw. "Get up," he cried, and ran to his brother's room, telling him to take our son to high ground. "Turn back, Joe, turn back," I cried, but the water hit us with such force that it tore the baby from my arms and submerged it in the muddy torrent.
90 children were killed by the flood. Many of them rest here, high up on the hillside at High Bradfield Church, well beyond the reach of any flood. Within seconds of the flood hitting Malin Bridge, the Cleacombe public house was all but pulled to the ground. New landlord George Bisbee and his family all perished, only to be survived by a daughter who was staying away for the night. The Stag Inn simply disappeared, taking with it 3 generations of the Armitage family.
My link with the flood is Eliza Armitage. Altogether there were 12 Armitages and they were all drowned in the flood.
In the days that followed, it was the surreal remains of the Cleacombe public house that gained much attention from the Sheffield people and media. In total, over 90 people were killed in Malin Bridge alone. The uncompromising nature of the flood meant it showed no mercy, but some did find themselves with a fighting chance.
Henry Whittles, who saved his family from the flood, was my great-great-grandfather. He said that he was awoken in the early hours of the morning, about 1 o'clock or so, by the noise, and at first he thought that someone was breaking into the house.
Well, I jumped out of bed to see if anybody were breaking in, but I'd hardly gone a few steps when I found I were in water. And it were rising fast.
He got out of bed and went to go down the stairs, and he said the first step that he took was actually in the water. The water had come up there. He realised then that it was a flood.
Well, Henry just turned round and cried, "Get onto bed!" And then he whipped Babby up and tumbled him on and then pushed bed into corner wall.
Got them all, his wife and 5 children altogether, on a bed in the corner of the room. And just at that moment, the corner of the house was swept away completely. So it exposed all the room and most of the floor went. It was just the corner with the bed on that was actually clear of the water. And he was able to, by putting his hands on each wall either side of the bed, he was able to keep his wife and children on the bed in the corner.
It were floating in icy water. I knew I couldn't go anywhere out at corner at room, because by then corner at room were all they were.
The water rose right up to where he was standing, and as he said, he could. Some people actually floated past him so near that he could actually reach out and touch them. But if he'd saved them, he'd have had to let go of his own wife and children.
We were lucky that night, bloody lucky.
Hey, Henry, don't swear.
Of those that did hear of the crack in the dam wall, some simply ignored the impending danger, disbelieving that such a huge structure could ever break.
My name's Mrs. Kirk, and I lived in a cottage just behind the Barrel Inn at Dam Flask, with my husband Thomas and my lodger Mr. Birkinshaw. Only he were always known as Sheffield Harry. On the Friday of the flood, I'd heard lots of warnings to get out because dam were going to burst, but Harry would have none of it.
Don't you worry yourself. I've worked on Redmire's Dam and on this one, and they're safe as houses. There's no pulp enough to break through that wall, so you take it easy, lass.
But Harry, Mr. Horsfield next door says it's a very long crack and it's getting bigger by the minute.
Yeah, they're just getting hysterical. I was talking to old Walton at Barrel here. He's getting his wife and Babby up to higher ground in all this rain. They're more likely to get a chill than to die of a flood. Anyway, I'm going to bed. Got an early start in the morning.
Henry Birkinshaw, more commonly known as Sheffield Harry, was 36 years old and was found on the 12th of March nearly 2 miles away in Loxley, his body almost unrecognisable. The devastation left by the flood was immense. Whole families were killed, houses and hamlets washed away, and the many mills that lined the valley were totally demolished. For days after the flood, Sheffield was a city in shock. The trauma suffered by the townspeople was inconceivable. For close-knit communities such as Malin Bridge, Hillsborough and Neepsend, the remaining survivors were left to rely on the goodwill of their neighbours, their families, and for many their faith.
When there's a natural disaster of any sort, the people tend to look towards the church because they don't know what else to do and they don't know where else to go. And so certainly in terms of comforting the bereaved, in terms of taking funerals and all that side of pastoral care, the churches would have, all the different churches, would have a big part to play. I mean, just like they did at the Hillsborough disaster, which is only a few years ago, they had a big part to play in it all.
The harsh reality of the flood was made all too clear in the days that followed. Accounts from the time report bodies laid strewn across the fields, and the mangled remains of men, women and children made identification almost impossible in some cases, and too gruesome in others. A morbid relic from the time is the death mask of Joseph Goddard, his body so badly battered that the face was cast in order that no one would have to see the actual body. Police records show that bodies were recovered from the branches of trees, others dug out of the mud. A man was found caught between a beam and the wall of a house. The body of a girl about the age of 12 was found cut in two. Many Sheffielders travelled throughout South Yorkshire, retracing the path of the flood in a desperate attempt to find and claim their family members. Bodies were swept away great distances. 13 were found over 15 miles away in Rotherham, and several were found at Doncaster, a distance of 27 miles from the reservoir. 2 days after the flood, Monday's edition of the Sheffield and Rotherham Independent newspaper carried personal adverts, an attempt by some to find their loved ones. Out of the many tragic stories of lost lives arose a few strange and amusing stories of survival.
Well, this is Joseph Chapman himself. He must have thought something was going to happen to himself, so he climbed inside this wooden box and floated out with waters, and his house got destroyed. And rescuers wondered where he'd gone, fearing worse for him, only to find that he was swirling about it river, stuck on a mud bank in the middle of the river. And as I said, they put a nightshirt or a gown or something on him to cover him up from freezing waters.
By Monday the 14th of March, more than 156 bodies had been discovered. Some bodies were found 6 weeks after the flood, and historians have since attributed 250 deaths as a consequence of the flood.
Whoe'er may be blamed for the recent distress, our duty to God it makes none the less. Whate'er be the fault this is most true. The flood is a warning to me and to you.
At the chamber of the town hall, a relief committee was formed shortly after the disaster in order to help the townspeople. Donations came in from all sources. Mayor Thomas Jessup immediately pledged £200, the equivalent of about £100,000 today. Local steel magnates John Brown and Company committed a similar amount.
We have now in Sheffield an amount of distress unparalleled in my time, and that distress must be relieved as quickly as possible.
Her Majesty has commanded me to add the expression...
Queen Victoria also sent a letter of sympathy and a donation of £200.
And exposed to suffering of every description.
Over the next 2 months, the Relief Committee reported it had received £52,000. Using the average earnings index, this is the equivalent today of £26 million. The Relief Committee was formed to address the immediate needs of those affected by the flood. The money was used to replace items of clothing, shoes, over 4,000 pairs in all. It paid for lost and damaged furniture, workmen's tools, and even food. By April, over 20,000 people had received help from the donations. However, from a total of £52,000, just over £19,000 was spent. Of the remaining £32,500, a portion was given to hospitals and the remainder given back to the donors. Acknowledging their liability, the Waterworks Company formed a 3-man commission to assess the many thousands of compensation claims. Under the leadership of William Overend QC, the Claims Committee was assigned the task of hearing and awarding per individual case, over 6,000 for destroyed property and several hundred for claims of death and injury.
When we reached home, it was to find our 3 children laid out on a bank behind the house. When we buried them, a lawyer told us we could claim some money for their loss. Sheffield had been given lots of money as compensation for all victims. And Mr. Sykes, for instance, had been given £487 for the loss of some books. Well, we went to hearing, and they told us we could only claim for the loss of our 13-year-old who worked in tannery. Others were considered too young to count as a loss. And we only rented basement, so nothing could be given for that, even though we'd lost our home and everything. So we came away with £25.
£25 for the loss of 3 children and all we possessed. Now my job's gone, with no home, and everything in house is lost. We'd have been better off being drowned with the children.
At the end of March, the Waterworks Company had made a statement, and so began the inquest. The events were recounted, the engineers and the public were called to give evidence, the dam build was described, the deaths were revisited. The engineers insisted a landslip had caused the dam to shift leading to the break. The prosecutors insisted the Waterworks Company had failed to build the dam correctly.
Your evidence yesterday was that the work was perfect.
As perfect as human work can be.
After much debate, emotions and accusations, the jury deliberated and 20 minutes later delivered a verdict.
In our opinion, there has not been that engineering skill and attention in the construction of the works which their magnitude and importance demanded.
A government inspection of all future works was also recommended. Finally, the deep regret at the fateful loss of life closed the proceedings. In 1875, the Dale Dyke Dam was finally finished. The dam wall was rebuilt 150 yards upstream, and today it holds around 550 million gallons of drinking water and dutifully serves the people of Sheffield as it was meant to all those years ago. The lessons learnt from the failure of the Dale Dyke Dam are still utilised in dam building today, helping engineers provide safe and solid reservoirs. The disaster that was the Sheffield Flood will never go away. Each anniversary reminds us what price our ancestors paid for their progress. On the night of the 11th of March 1864, Sheffield changed forever. Whether an act of Mother Nature or grave human error, the least we can do is continue the memory.
The most amazing thing about it is the stories of real, sadness, but real bravery, real courage. And Sheffield can be proud of so many people whilst mourning that huge loss all those years ago.